Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into today's episode of What's New in Data. Super excited about our guest today. We have Alex Levin, CEO and founder at Regal.io. Alex, how are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Alex, tell the listeners a bit about yourself.
Sure. So I don't know how far back you want me to go, but I grew up on the East Coast in New York. I went to liberal arts for undergrad, so really learned a lot of practical things. And luckily, I think I read an article right as I was graduating, become famous now, called "Software, is Eating the World," and understood, I think, pretty quickly that there would be no business that wasn't a software business. And went to work in tech, and got addicted to that type of business, and really have worked for startups ever since. Um, my co-founder Rebecca and I started Regal 3 years ago now. So this is the first time where we've really been the founders of the company. And Regal is very focused on serving organizations that are selling to consumers. So, imagine in life insurance or healthcare or education, you may go online and look for a new program. There's an admission person that's actually working with you to make sure that you're getting the right program. So we provide the software to those admissions teams to make sure they're able to get in touch with you and, use the right script when they're talking with you, and then, give you the right information. So we focused on helping them, treat millions of customers like one in a million.
What inspired you to start Regal? What was the story behind making the company?
Yeah. So for years, we worked for consumer businesses, and the last one we worked for was in the home services industry, called Angie now, which owns Angie's List and Home Advisor, Handy. And we thought our job was to digitize all of the buying home services. So the idea was, don't go to Main Street anymore, but talk to somebody, go on the internet and find a fence installation or, whatever it is you're looking for. Very quickly, we realized that we can attract huge numbers of people, and that wasn't the problem. But our conversion flow was actually much worse than offline. So, if you came to us and you came to a Main Street vendor, if you will, you were more likely to buy from a Main Street vendor. And we thought we were fancy technology people, and, it was embarrassing that despite many, many efforts to improve the digital conversion funnels, we couldn't get it as good as offline. And eventually we realized that when we happen to have a conversation with the customer for some reason, customer support, the conversion rates went right back up. So we started building out teams that intentionally would talk to people, never cold calling. Like, these are people coming in saying, I need a home remodel. We go, hey, you have a house, you need a remodel. Like, tell us what, to build trust, it allowed them to ask questions, allowed them to understand what they were going to buy. And so we ended up building teams of thousands of people that would do. The challenge was that none of the technology was built for that, right? Most contact center technology is built for the opposite. We've all experienced this. It's built for deflect customer inbound, never talk, don't touch your customer with a 10-foot pole, right? They don't want to talk to you online. And, in customer service, maybe there's a place for that. But in these businesses that are selling, I'd say, more considered products, or, think of, opening a bank account, think of the medicine you need to get, think of, I don't know, what car you're going to buy. Like, in those industries, it actually is helpful to talk to somebody. And so it's a very different playbook than the old school retail companies that are trying to deflect your inbound. And we ended up starting Regal on the premise that, people should treat customers like royalty. People should, have the technology and the tools to find the right customer, reach with the right message in the right channel, and take SoFi as an example as a customer who does student loan refinance, things like that, where you may go online on your cell phone and go to SoFi.com and try to do it, but it's kind of hard on a little screen to do it now. So, instead, if you're abandoning, you'll get a call. We can do cool things like on your cell phone, we can have it show up as SoFi instead of a random number. You can also text you from the same number. You can choose which channel you want to engage in. You make sure we know everything about what you're trying to do and say, hi, John, I see you're stuck in this specific thing. Let me help you, and make sure that that's a good experience for the customer.
That's excellent. And, I think, especially with all these digital touch points, having a closer relationship with the customer, you can just talk to them and have a a 360 view of them is more important than ever. And I love the SoFi story that you mentioned specifically, because ultimately you have to tie this back into the customer experience. Speaking of customer experience, tell us about a bit about the unified customer profile and why that's important for businesses to build.
Yeah. So take a like kind of big step back and say like broadly organizations understand the data is important. Like kind of that like message they've gotten. Most organizations are focused on using data for analytics, for reporting, for things like, but as you know, as organizations, particularly the consumer side, have more and more data about their customers, first party data about their customers. Remember third party data. I'm so fine. I know more and more about you have a bank account with us, you own a home, you have a personal loan, and now we're dealing with your student loan. They have all this information. The opportunities to start using that information to enhance the experience for the customer. So sometimes the place I started to say, imagine a 2x2 framework. On one side is like how big is your business, and on the other side is how like personalized are you being. So a very small successful mom and pop shop in a little town, what are they doing? Well, they know everything about it. They know your pets, your kids, your how, like, and you walk in, they say, oh, hey, John, I saw your kids the other day and your dog was eating my bushes and, so on and so forth. And here's exactly the life insurance product you need. And so they're able to make it feel like entirely personalized at that smaller scale. Problem is that as people get to that bigger scale, even though they in theory have all this data about you, probably somewhere, they don't use it for one reason or another. And so they are handling many more customers, but they're treating them like they're all the same instead of treating them like one in a million. And so the importance to your question of having the unified customer profiles to be able to actually take everything you know about the customer, put it somewhere that can be used operationally to drive customization, personalization across the channels they're using to engage the customer. So just to use like a specific example, a very simple one, if you're going to have to go call the 1,000 people that came in and spoke with you, which one do you call first? Right? Is it something where you just dial every number in the order they came in? Well, probably what a lot of companies do today, but there's no way that's the right answer. Maybe one person has an urgent problem. Maybe somebody else works during the day and can't answer a call during the day. Maybe somebody else, actually like, there's the husband and the wife are both customers and you should know they're related and know that you should always call one of them about certain issues. So those are things that you need to start knowing. And when it was something at a, very small scale business, people were able to do that. And these big companies aren't able to do it yet. So that's really the holy grail is how do you start treating those customers as if you knew everything about them?
And how are you solving that problem with Regal.io?
Sure. So start with the customer profile. So in email marketing was where we first started seeing the idea of a unified customer profile. So particularly in retail and a little bit in media, right? You put in your email address and they'd start knowing which, websites you visited, what behaviors you took, what you did on the, and they started personalizing emails to you. And we saw very quickly increased open rates in email, higher engagement rate from customers by using that personalization. Uh, okay. Everyone who shops online now wants the rest of their life online. Things like healthcare are a bit more complicated than like buying a pair of jeans on the internet. So, there's slightly different information that's involved. So our unified customer profiles are a bit more sophisticated than those that existed in retail. And they allow us to know not just what websites you visited, but what happened in the conversations you had with the brand, what happened in your health interactions, right? So that we can go back and make sure we're making the right engagement. As a common example in healthcare, when there's a negative diagnosis of some kind, only half the time does the patient actually go and take the next action, which is terrible for everybody. Bad for the patient because you're going to like, let's say they found a fracture, you're going to still have that fracture. Bad for the doctor because they're not making money from it. It's bad for the health system because they'd much rather you take care of it now in a preventative way than that it get infected. And now there's a bigger thing that the health system has to pay for. So if we know everything, in one place that can make sure we're engaging you in the right way to get you to come back in and get that fracture fixed, the result that the actual health outcome is much better for the patient. So, what do we do with the data? We actually give people a journey builder that will allow them to do cross-channel orchestration, text, call, emails, actually use webhooks to engage other channels like direct mail. And then we've actually built contact center software that allows companies, nurses or agents actually sit in Regal and have those conversations. So ballpark typical answer rates on a phone call in the United States are 10%. On Regal, on average, across our whole platform, we're over 30%. So much, much higher engagement rate. And we also have SMS. We also have email. And, we do that with a lot of sort of new capabilities that didn't exist 5 years ago.
And what do you attribute the increase in answer rates to specifically with your product?
Yeah, three things primarily. So one is, we use consistency and branding across all these channels. So everything comes from the same phone number. We can, like I said, have a deal with the carriers to make sure it's showing up as the name of your health provider so that you know who it is and you're not, forgetting that random number that called you is actually something important. So two is, we can make sure that we have an aggregated unified customer profile so that you can do this personalization. And then for sure, the third piece is the orchestration. You can do a lot. You can now test and iterate and try figuring out what is the right sequence of outreach, depending on the situation to drive the best outcome. And it can be very different, by industry, by sort of use case. Is this an acquisition use case, a retention use case, cross sell? There may be different ways that you engage people, but net, we're trying to create a situation where both parties, the customer and the business, have a better outcome. So if you remember, you sometimes put your phone number in a site, they call you 18 times. It's terrible for everybody. It's a waste of time for the business, and you have a shitty experience with that business. So AAA is a customer of ours. They have a roadside assistance team. Like, you've told them something is wrong and they're trying to engage with you. They don't want to call you 18 times. They want to find the right way to engage you so that in that moment, they can help you with the problem you're having.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, there's so many digital touch points with customers and so many digital distractions for them. So, the fact that Regal.io has, better answer rates is so critical because having the ear or the attention of a consumer is like gold right now. There's just so many forces competing to grab their attention. And like you said, one of the key things is, that unified customer profile, which allows you to personalize. But then the other one you mentioned is the the fact that the brand appears in the outreach, right? So it's not some unknown number, some random area code calling you, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's your insurance company, it's your healthcare provider, it's your bank, right? Like that kind of stuff. Like if I looked at my phone and saw someone was calling me, I get so many, everyone gets so many spam calls. But if someone that I already know that I work with and someone that I'm already a customer for, I'm much more likely to answer the phone. And it sounds like, these outreaches that your users are doing are also in the critical line of business.
Yeah, look, once upon a time, everybody went and visited a school in person. Now, a lot of schools are digital, or you can't go visit in person for one reason or another. So, when you want to learn about it, like, what are you going to do? Are you just going to go to the website and look at pictures? Well, sure, that's a start. Like, if it's really going to be a decision that you make at some point, you're going to want to engage in real conversation. So, I think people's first inclination is to say, "Oh no, I don't want a conversation." But the second is something important, whether it's banking or health or education. People immediately actually want to engage with that brand and want to make sure that they're asking the questions that they have and, figuring out, is this the right solution for them?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, like we touched on a bit, there's quite a bit of ways you can reach the consumer now, whether it's through social media, through, direct phone calls. We're used to this remote first landscape. There's telehealth, even to talk, meet with your healthcare providers. So, what would you say, what's your advice to, digital marketers or go to market folks on the best ways to reach customers without interrupting them?
Yeah. I was a marketer for many years. So, a couple thoughts come to mind. So first, if you only try to reach somebody once and when they don't sort of engage with you, you give up with that, you're not going to be a very good marketer. When it's top of the funnel, a lot of studies have shown you need to reach somebody 6, 7, 8 times across different channels before they go, oh, I really do want a Tesla. Like, not like the first time you hear about it, you're going to do it. A friend tells you about it. You see an ad and you see it in the, store and you see it on TV. Now all of a sudden you are. So that's one. Two is, I think for a long time, it's been so easy to put dollars into digital channels and just click spend that has become the default for most marketers is, oh yeah, I'm just going to put 100 grand in Google, put 200 grand in Facebook. Oh, I'm going to click and send an email. But just because it's easy doesn't it's the only way to engage a customer. I think a lot of marketers have forgotten about channels that are perhaps harder to execute, but really important to move somebody through the funnel. So obviously we work with a lot of teams that use the conversation somebody through the funnel. So that's an important one. But it could be direct mail, it could be local meetings, it could be door to door. I think as a marketer, don't overlook a channel just because it's operationally complex. Perhaps because it's operation complex, fewer people are doing it and get better channel. And don't believe that because it's operation complex, it's a higher cost channel. So, a lot of people forget that, Google is getting very expensive. In the marginal cost of acquiring more customers on a channel like Google, is really quite high. So compared to, starting a new channel, like going door to door, Google actually is often more expensive than a human interaction expensive. So I think people sort of approach they just need to take a first principles approach and make sure they're looking at it from fresh eyes and not assuming that digital channels are the only way to go. The last one I'd say is, every channel has gone through this transition from batch and send, meaning treating everybody the same, to more personalization. Email made that transition, direct mail, out of home is even going through this, like figuring out how to personalize messages for each user. And same thing is now coming into, this sort of phone channel. And of course, that's going to lead to better outcomes. So, when we talk with organizations that think they're very sophisticated, but are still treating everybody the same, they may be sophisticated from an efficiency standpoint. That's not the way to make the most from that customer base. It's not the way to get the customer, what they need. I think, you really have to rethink your data strategy, rethink your technology strategy to empower you as a business to customize across every channel what you're doing. And without that, you're going to get left behind because ultimately it's an arms race. You're in the, you know, what are we going to say? The hair care industry, and your competitor starts doing something better than you do. If you don't catch up, you're going to be out of business very soon because your competitor is going to win the majority of help.
Yeah, and I love that one point that you brought up, which is, cost per click is becoming more expensive than ever on these digital channels. And a lot of digital marketing teams are assuming that, you just go to Google, you go to Facebook, you go to Instagram, you go to Twitter ads, Snapchat ads, whatever. And, that's your marketing strategy. You just pay someone for access to their audience. And, maybe that's just a side effect after the COVID era where everything was just digital outreach. But you mentioned door to door as a tactic that, people are probably overlooking right now, and sort of boots on the ground marketing. Are you saying that more marketing teams should consider, just having, going in person and trying to reach the consumer, you know, in more of a in-person fashion?
Yeah, broadly, the distinction I would make at the highest level is between rented channels and owned channels. When you go on Twitter or LinkedIn or something else and you get a follower, you don't own that relationship. LinkedIn does. LinkedIn decides whether or not they're going to show your post to that person. LinkedIn decides how many people to show it to. LinkedIn decides if they're going to kick you off the platform or kick your customer off the platform. They may raise the price for the thing that you're doing. You really have very little control. And so a lot of the best businesses have learned this and have moved to models where it's own channels, whether it's an SMS relationship with a customer or a phone relationship or door to door. Take back control over what you're doing. And yes, I think one way of looking at it is directly what is the of each of these channels. And it is true that actually a lot of these operational channels are cheaper on a CAC basis than people believe. But I think another one is take back control over your destiny. Google SEM is not getting better year over year. It's getting worse, meaning the prices are going up, competition is going up. You are not in control. So, as an example, in the home services industry, Google all of a sudden realized that flights was a very good business. Guess what they did? They made Google Flights. So now, if you're Travelocity, not only are you paying Google for ads, you're competing with Google, for that same customer. And they've done the same. services. They've done the same thing in other industries as well. So you are not in control of your own destiny if all you're relying on are channels that you're renting. At some point, you need to take ownership over that customer relationship.
Absolutely. And yeah, you see that in so many industries where, you know, and this is very common in the data industry too. Snowflake is AWS's number one customer. At the same time, they compete with one of their large product portfolios, which is, Redshift and their data lake offerings. And, I'm very used to seeing this in the data industry and, just the what's new in data episode that came out just recently was, Microsoft Fabric versus Databricks, where, Microsoft has been selling Databricks for years, and now they suddenly came up with a product that has they don't call it a competitor, but quite a bit of overlap. So, and whether you're, a cloud platform or, a marketer at a B2C company, you really have to think outside the box and see how do I, own my relationships and give myself more leverage in these scenarios.
Yeah. The other thing that's happening in a lot of organizations now, they're thinking through, what to do about the explosion of SaaS inside their organization. So like 5 years, 10 years, kind of you let employees get every vertical SaaS software that existed, even if it overlapped with three other products internally. And now CIOs or procurement departments are saying, well, no, even if it's not perfect for every solution, we want one provider for these things. And so I think, as a B2B provider, we think about how to make sure that we survive in that role. And, you know, as when we talk with our customers, we try to show them like where there's opportunities to consolidate software using us so they don't need four different products. They can use just us. And where, they should use us instead of other softwares that exist.
Absolutely. And Real.io itself, there's a data abstraction to it as well. There's concept of, data going in, data going out. You have integrations with, SaaS products like HubSpot and Salesforce, and even ones like Segment, which will bring data from multiple types of endpoints into Regal. What is your strategy around enabling your users with data?
Yeah. We try to just be a very good data steward at this point. So make it easy for people to send data from whatever source. People sending us UPS delivery data so they can call when a box arrives and do like an opening call together. We have people sending us, like you say, data from the native integrations, and we have people who send us data just to our API because they want to, use that as a way of prioritizing, who they're engaging with and how. The other thing we do quite well today is beyond having our own recording, we allow any data that we are creating be pumped back out into their own, our customer data infrastructure. So it could be a Snowflake data share, it could be the data going back to an S3 bucket for them to use. But we don't lock them into using our reporting. And we don't lock the data that we create inside Rigo. So as an example, whenever there are conversations, we extract a lot of information about what was said, how high intent it was, what the sentiment was, what next best actions should be. We don't lock that in, right? We allow people to take that out. And I think it's one of the more fascinating pieces of data that people are not using today is like that rich conversational data. Historically, what happened is like a salesperson would take like one or two sentence notes to remind themselves like, this person loves cats and they want to talk next week. That was quasi useless even to the salesperson, definitely useless to another salesperson because it didn't say anything interesting. And marketing or other data teams couldn't go and use that to personalize other channels because it wasn't structured in a valuable way. So one of the more interesting things we do is to structure what happens in the conversations into data such that it can be reused downstream. Somebody's telling you they want an SUV, not a truck. When they go back on the website, you should be showing them an SUV, not a truck, right? When you send the next email, you should be showing the right thing. So make sure what's happening in the conversation is actually driving the right next action. Customers expect that when they talk with your brand or interact with your brand in any way, that you should know that. And they're disappointed when they find out that they told your, agent something and actually you have no idea that they did it. So as customer expectations go up for what brands should be able to do, brands have to have the technology to keep up with them.
Absolutely. And I see with Regal.io, you do a great job piping data out into those, operational systems of engagement, those operational sales and marketing engines like Salesforce and HubSpot. But you also, like you mentioned, you support Snowflake data share, you support Amazon S3, things are just more like infrastructure in terms of storing the data long term. What would you say has had the most traction and value?
From a data perspective,
Yeah.
today, I'd say the majority of companies think more about how to get data into Regal, and like they are starting to use the data that we create. I think only the more sophisticated the organizations invested more in their own reporting infrastructure that want to make sure our data goes into their infrastructure. So I think it depends on the sophistication of the customer. Just sticks to one, half dozen to the other, which, we're happy either way, whether they use our reporting or their own. I do think over time, though, like I said, that the rich conversational information is what will be so valuable. Today, if you went to brand X that doesn't work with us, they might know what sites you visit, what pages within their site you visited. If you went and talked to their customer support team or sales team, that would be lost for all intents and purposes. And that's a waste. People talk faster than they write. People are more open when they're talking. So there's so much rich information about the customer that you're missing by not capturing that information, not for nefarious purposes, for the opposite. Imagine 100 years ago, you'd walk into a club and they might say, "Oh, John, it's wonderful to see you. Here's your favorite table. And we'll put on your favorite music. Here's the drink you like." A private club, not like a big club. You they did that because they paid attention to you. They watched you, not in a way that was bad, in a way that made your life easier. So, we should expect the same for brands that we work with. The way I sometimes frame this is to say a lot of brands came online believing that their technology would differentiate it. But take financial services. It turns out most of these big financial services companies online use the same backend, literally the exact same backend. So they go, okay, it's not technology, it's brand. We're our brand is different. Well, let me tell you what, like that is not enough of a differentiator. In banking, you know what the differentiator is ultimately, and has always been service. So at some point, if you're Vero, if you're Chime, you need to invest in service as a way of differentiating between you and another company. Because if the customer feels a connection to somebody at your company, even if you make a mistake, they'll stay. But if not, if it's just a digital product, they're going to move their money to the next online bank the second that they feel like.
Absolutely, and that's why I mean, I'm one of those, maybe you can call it an outlier, but I like personalization. And my wife is the same, she'll often buy products from ads that are, very hyper personalized 'cause it makes your life easier. It's just it knows your tendencies, your affinities, your interests, and, you're essentially fed stuff that's relevant to you, right? And like you said, it you can use data to enrich the lives of your customers for sure. And, we're seeing this across the board where, whether it's, storing your data in Snowflake or BigQuery, some sort of warehouse, ultimately the goal with that data is, not just to store it, but to operationalize it and productize it for your own customers. So what you're describing very much fits what many companies are trying to accomplish internally, and certainly sounds like an accelerator to value with the consumers. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there's so much exciting stuff going on in the market and technology, innovation, marketing, growth. What are some of the things that you're most excited about?
Coming up. So Michael and I do invest in startups, and think the obvious thing is a lot of exciting advancements within AI to be able to have sort of, AI assistants and AI recommendations, and even perhaps AI that replaces some of the jobs that, people used to do and don't need to do anymore. So certainly watch that very closely. From a customer engagement, obviously, like I believe that these sort of conversations are a very important future channel. In certain industries, it's status quo. So, like in insurance, every company has a sales team. In other industries, it doesn't exist today. So, a lot of retail brands believe customer service is a call center and haven't invested in it. Well, let me tell you what, it is not a call center. Like it is very important revenue driver. You can't cut your costs to success. At some point, these brands are going to have to invest in differentiated service. And so I do think like even in retail online, you'll see higher levels of service at some point, um, as everything else becomes more commoditized. I think what else I would say is happening in sort of this world. Definitely, like, one of the more frustrating parts of this, I would say, is despite the promises of data, like CDPs to sort of have the models of data and, like, understand all your data and, know what to do with it. The reality, every company I've ever worked at, and certainly a lot of companies I've seen, is that data is labeled very badly. Every customer labels data differently. Very hard to then do analysis. Even when you go work with the data team, there's 8 different fields labeled conversion event. Well, which conversion event is it that we need to use? And then it becomes very difficult to extract learnings from it, certainly within your own company or across companies to, sort of use machine learning to make higher order decisions based off of it because data labeling was so bad. So I am optimistic that over time there will be different types of solutions to that. But today it's a huge problem. And so I
Mm.
really, if there are people out there looking for a business to go into, like, data labeling within these sort of infrastructures and, like, how you create, sort of uniformity across companies within the industry so that you can start doing benchmarking and comparison machine learning is very valuable.
Yeah, and that's one of the amazing magical powers of LLMs is being able to contextualize a lot of that unstructured information, and we're just starting to scrape the surface. We're going to see some great applications of that, and like you mentioned, it's a big growth area, and we'll see some major productivity gains and some productized consumer facing enhancements to customer experiences. So it's certainly an exciting time, and you know we'll definitely see how it all evolves, and we keep close track of it here on what's new in data as well. I we've been having so many discussions on AI here. It's coming up all the time, not just because we just want to talk about AI, but that's such a compelling area. And, I even had a LinkedIn post where it's like, I'm going to challenge myself to not talk about AI on the next podcast. And it's impossible because it's everyone's thinking about it, and not, and you've seen other industries where there was a lot of hype and a lot of talk, but not much happened. But I think AI has just already completely blown the lid off of, amazing consumer experiences and value for customers.
Well,
So,
look,
it's
we're
just a
trying to
matter
transition
of,
the same way the internet was a major transition, computing was, you know, smartphone. Like, for sure, it's a major transition. That said, like, when you look at each of those transition, a large majority of those businesses that were built on them fail. Huge percentage fail. And the same thing will happen in AI. Huge percentage of business. And there will be fraud in the same way, when all of a sudden, Bitcoin became big, like, there was massive fraud. It will happen again. People will lose a lot of money. But yeah, net long term, I agree with you. There is the kernel of a critical piece of infrastructure. And I think the other, like, piece that I'm optimistic about more than other people, I think there have been all these stories about AI taking people's job. Never in any of these transitions has the new technology resulted in lower numbers of jobs. Jobs change for sure, but net, the efficiency that it brought has actually created new opportunities, not taken away opportunities. So I'm very optimistic about AI as a deflationary force, which could be good for the world because it allows us to lower costs on products. But net, I still believe it'll create a lot of jobs.
100% in agreement. It's really about empowering the person and making them more productive. And I recently had Patrick Miller, who led enterprise AI at Google before. Now he leads data and AI at Newfront. And even at Google, I mean, it was all about having a human in the loop and empowering the human. And now that he's rolling out AI principles, more generic practice, yeah, having it's really about making people more active. And also at the same time, there's a ton of risk with just letting AI do its thing and without any oversight. So I think I really related to having a pilot in the cockpit, even if your aircraft's running on autopilot, right? So so we'll definitely see that for a long time. Alex Levin, CEO and founder of Regal.io. So great having you on What's New in Data. Where can people follow along with your work?
Sure. So please go to regal.io. or you can always email us at hello@regal. Basically, if calling customers, having conversations with their customers is critical to your business, critical to your consumer business, please reach out. We're fascinated by the topic, and, maybe we may be able to help.
Excellent. And those links will be down in the show notes for those who are of interest. Alex, thanks so much for joining. And thank you to everyone for tuning into today's episode.
Thank you.